Audrey, you were just elected to the Hunter Hall of Fame, and that was in May 1981. And I want to read from your biography here. It's wonderful. It says that you have an MLS from Columbia University. That's a master's in library science. That you are a professor of English at John Jay College, and now, of course, you're teaching at Hunter.
At Hunter, that's right.
That you are advisory editor to Black Scholar magazine, contributing editor to Black Box magazine, poetry editor. This is formerly poetry editor of Chrysalis. You served on the literature panel. I'm just reading your biography. You served on the literature panel of the National Endowment for the Arts, and you've just won an NEA, haven't you? For next year. What is that for? To work on your new book?
Yes, that's to work on a new collection of poetry. I must hasten to add that I no longer sit on the policy panel, and I did not sit at the time that I...
But you got the award.
That I got the award.
I understand that. Well, that's good to add. And you are the author of many books and articles, among them From a Land Where Other People Live, New York Head Shop and Museum, Coal, The Black Unicorn, and the Cancer Journals. You've been poet in residence at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. You won the Woman of the Year Award from Staten Island Community College. You've been guest poet probably many, many places, but what you have listed here is the Festival of International Women Artists in Copenhagen, and you've been guest artist at the second Festival of Black African Art and Culture in Lagos, Nigeria. Wasn't that
That's right.
In 1977 and in 1978 you were nominated for the National Book Award. Because we're such old friends, I'm going to luxuriate in a very long introduction. Do you mind sitting? Can you bear to sit and hear more about yourself?
Yes, of course, but
Okay,
you realize it's very strange, because when I process the things that you're saying through the actual sense of what was done and the doing, this intersects again with the music you were just playing, the changer and the changed. And of course, as it is over, that which has been done alters who I am. And so in hearing it over the space of time, it seems very different.
Well, maybe I won't go right into the rest of my introduction. Tell me what you mean by that first. I mean, what sounds very different first?
The question of being, for instance, poetry, when you speak of being a poet in residence at Tougaloo, of course, since that was so pivotal and that was so important in terms of my own development as a poet, as a speaker, as a teacher, the one line, poet in residence at Tougaloo College, over 12 years ago, sounds very strange compared to what a living consciousness, what a living presence it is in my life.
Well, that actually changed your life in some ways.
That changed my life markedly in so many ways. It was at Tougaloo that I realized that being a poet connected in all ways with everything that I was, all the different parts of me, and that it was work I had to do. And I had to do not only in terms of my writing, but I had to spread it. The consciousness of poeting, of being a poet, was something not merely in terms of the poetry I was writing, but in terms of a whole life view, a way of approaching and dealing with myself, the world, revolution, change. And yeah, it really altered my life. It altered my total consciousness.
That's very interesting. Do you think that Tougaloo, this is WBAI in New York, the producer is very eager for me to say that. It is WBAI in New York, and I'm talking with Audre Lorde. This is Women and the World in the 1980s. Do you think that it had a great impact in the writing of The Black Unicorn, for example? I mean, that experience, being in Mississippi, being with black students.
Well, again, because time telescopes, so The Black Unicorn was yet another step in a process that started at Tougaloo, of course. But the opportunity, first of all, to work with young black students. I had never been south before, further south in Washington. The opportunity to go into the South, and of course you remember what was happening in Jackson, Mississippi. This is 1968, the beginning of 1968. Tougaloo was still under attack, right? As a center for the Freedom Riders, there were night riders shooting up the campus, every other week practically. The chance to go even as a totally inarticulate, shy, unassuming poet, my first book was in the process of being published. It had not yet come out. And working with black students, working with students who really questioned and forced me to question what we were doing, how did we move, and what was the place, for instance, of our writing, of our poetry. And I came to see, first to feel, then to see, and then to share the fact that my poetry was, and theirs by extension, were part of our weaponry. That writing, that creativity was not separate from our living, was not separate from what we had to do from our work, that this was an aspect of our work, it was an aspect of my work. And both threatening and very, very satisfying.
Audrey, 1968. I mean, that's very stunning that you think of yourself as a shy, unassuming poet in 1968. I mean, I guess it's 12 years ago. I've never thought of you as a shy, unassuming poet.
That's because we talked a lot, but I did not talk. I wrote. And sharing the written word on paper was one thing from getting up before a group of kids and defending, right, who I was as well as what I was writing, and giving them something that they could use, And as always, I knew then, I think, not clearly what I still know now and am much more articulate about, that the best thing I have to give anyone has got to come out of myself, or it doesn't, you can pick it up on the street, you can pick it up on Woolworths, right? Unless it is something that is anchored in the heaviest power I know, and that is me.
Mm-hmm. Well, this raises the whole issue of 1968, though. I mean, and how long ago it was. I mean, that's why I raised that question and what was happening.
I learned it at Tougaloo. I learned to make a connection between the chaos outside and the real questions within. I learned there, for instance, that teaching really meant examining the things you most of all need to know, because I did not know how to teach. I had never taught before.
Was that your first teaching job?
That's right. And it was in the framework of Poet in Residence holding workshops. But I had never stood up before a group of other human beings before and tried to share something that I felt strongly about. When I felt strongly about something prior to that, I sat down and I wrote a poem, right? Uh-huh. And I did this, and I edited it, and when it was perfect, I sent it out into the world. I never got up in front and someone asked me a question, what? And just
And
talk.
You had then to think about
deal.
Where everything was coming from.
I had to
put it together.
That's right.
Well,
it was wonderful.
That is extraordinary. I wanted to say one other thing about 1968, which is such an extraordinary year in terms of the fact that right now we are so embattled, and your entire corpus of work is really dedicated to speaking, dedicated to getting out of that silence, the silence that they are trying to impose on us, and that our whole culture kind of imposes on us. And also the whole corpus of your work is dedicated to freedom, both freedom in its fullest political sense and freedom in a personal sense. And I just wonder if you could talk about that in terms of, and maybe even read some that would relate to that issue.
I think that silence is one of course, one of the ways in which we're controlled, one of the very effective implants by which we control ourselves. And it's something that each one of us individually and collectively will die of if we do not find a way to break it. And I've seen this come up over and over again in the women's movement, in the Black Power movement, in the lesbian movement, over and over again. Those questions that are acceptable can be asked, and always there is the tendency not to ask those that do not fit into a pattern. And there is a poem, I have a poem, as a matter of fact, that I'd like to read that comes out of that consciousness, that comes out of the ways in which I experience that deathly kind of silence over and over and over again in so many different guises. The title of it is A Song for Many Movements. Nobody wants to die on the way, caught between ghosts of whiteness and the real water. None of us wanted to leave our bones on the way to salvation. 3 planets to the left a century of light years ago. Our spices are separate and particular, but our skins sing in complementary keys. At 7:45, meantime, we were telling the same stories over and over and over. But broken down gods survive in the crevasses and mud pots of every beleaguered city, where it is obvious there are too many bodies to cart to the ovens or gallows, and our uses have become more important than our silence. Our uses have become more important than our silence. After the fall, there are too many empty cases of blood to bury or burn, and there will be no body left to listen, and our labor has become more important than our silence. Our labor has become more important than our silence.
That's really so important. You're reading from the Black Unicorn.
Yeah.
Where you have one other poem that I'd love you to read, which is Litany for Survival. Would you do that now?
Now? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful poem.
Actually, the title of this poem, as I always like to announce, is A Litany for Survival number 42. Only so that we should keep in our consciousness the fact that survival is not a one-time decision. It's not a one-time act. It's something that goes on and on and on. And you make a commitment in the same way I make a commitment to myself. I make a commitment to my working. I make a commitment to my survival and to being able to see it wherever it occurs. A litany for survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawn, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the deaths of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. So when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. And when we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So, it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
Well, you know, I just am always so cheered, Audrey, when I read that poem. I mean, every time I get a savage review, I look at that poem.
And you think, hey, I really wrote it. It got to see the light of
That's
print,
right?
It's
That's
out
right.
there doing its work.
That's right.
It.
That's right. So that is just one of the most empowering
I'm glad.
Poems for me personally, and my very favorite. It's the one thing I turn to after each wretched review until the next good review comes.
I'm glad.
I read that poem.
It wasn't empowering. I would like to tell you a little bit about how the poem came to be written. It was a very empowering experience for me, too. I wrote that was the first poem I wrote after the first operation that I had. It was a biopsy for a breast tumor, which was thought to be cancerous and turned out not to be. And the consciousness that I had then of mortality, of what it meant, the decisions I had to make in myself before I knew the outcome of the operation, and the sense of really terror even after it, that this might not be, in fact, the end of it. Probably a body knowledge of what was taking place within myself, gave rise to, again, the questioning of my own survival. And this poem really erupted, because in some real sense I thought how lucky that I have been given what I have been given, and that I'm still even sentient and able to do what I was doing. It felt like a great gift. And putting that together with the sense of fear, or maybe the consciousness of the sense of fear, because we live in fear all the time, and it's silence about that fear so very often that immobilizes us rather than even the fear itself. So coming to touch all of these things and putting them together, I learned, as I wrote that poem, what the poem is.
I mean, I see it as contiguous with what you've said many times, in Meridel Lesueur, who has indeed survived to be, 81, said recently, I mean, survival is the best resistance.
It certainly is.
And when you can mix it with joy and other pieces of power,
I have
you
to
really
tell
have...
I have to tell you, Blanche, I need to perhaps talk a little more about survival, because when I say that, I have heard people say, oh, but I'm not content to survive, because and implicit in that response is a certain kind of denigration of what survival is. That is to say, they reduce survival to mere existence. And that is not survival.
No, it isn't. And certainly not for you.
That's right. Implicit in survival is joy, mobility, and effectiveness. And effectiveness is always relative. I mean, none of us are going to move the earth 1 millimeter from its axis. But if we do what we need to be doing, then we will leave something that continues beyond ourselves, and that is survival.
There's a wonderful review of your book, The Black Unicorn, by Bob Steptoe of Yale, who just wrote it's a very long, about a 6-page review in Parnassus, which is the poetry review. It was in the winter of 1979, and he ends that review, which is a great flourish of yours, one of your great flourishes, in which he says the success of the Black Unicorn may be seen in the fact that when the poet declares, "I will eat the last signs of my weakness, remove the scars of old childhood wars, and dare to enter the forest whistling," we believe her. And I think that if people would look at, for instance, your whole bunch of essays beginning with poetry is not a luxury, or even before that, beginning with what was that kind of first article that you had that really gave rise to the cancer journals?
Transformation of silence into silence,
which was what was called the transformation of silence into language and action,
Yes.
just to be accurate, which you gave at the MLA, and then from there to the cancer journals, which won the ALA, the American Library Association's Best Gay Book of the Year award, which I think is just wonderful.
So do I.
Yeah,
Having been a librarian, having been part of the American Library Association long before there was ever a gay caucus, it pleasures my heart too.
It's just wonderful. But I think that kind of commitment to life lived in its fullest is what those of us who are privileged to be your friends certainly get a lot. I mean, we have some very stormy times together, but we always have very full stormy times, and when we have fun, we have full fun. How do you do it, Audrey? What isn't that a quirky question? what are some of the things that you can tell people?
Well,
I mean, one thing is that we're never bored. I was disgusted, if I could just sort of shape my question better. I was disgusted to read Arthur Bell's review of the Writers' Congress, in which he revealed himself this racist, reactionary monster. And the theme running through his review was ennui, boredom. He was bored in the midst of 3,000 writers coming together to share ideas. And I was thinking, I mean, imagine being bored. Well, that's something we've never experienced, have we? How are you bored?
That, that is very sad. That's a very sad story you just told me about Arthur Bell, whose review, by the way, I haven't read because the Congress was difficult and exciting enough.
Without reading bilious
reviews of it. I don't know how you could review a conference unless you can share what it was you felt. And if he felt bored, then I feel really very sorry.
That's the sense you have of people who say they're bored, that they're just not alive in the way that we understand that
But the question
word.
of living life to its fullest requires that we know at all times the possibilities of what feeling fully means. And I think that boredom, being turned off, being unwilling to grasp fully even pain, is a way of keeping us moving in a very prescripted, very narrow, very regimented position, i.e., to fulfill our part of the machine. When we live in what we are feeling, when we recognize a kind of measurement, internal measurement, as to what is really satisfying, then we're less likely to settle for that non-life. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes living fully such a powerful, such a potent tool for both change and movement.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the imagination that one has to have. I mean, that you can imagine going from writing a poem to writing a novel. And I want to talk about your novel, but also from going to writing a poem to writing a novel.
It's a biomythography.
Yeah, well, all right. You'll have to tell us about it. And then to becoming an editor and to creating a new form of journal and publishing house, which you're working on. I want you to talk about the Kitchen Table Press. Talk about the biomythography first.
The biomythography will be published in 1982 by Persephone Press. The title of it is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. And it's a biomythography, not a novel.
And not a biography, not an autobiography.
It's not an autobiography. It's not a work of myth. However, it is fiction, which, of course, very effectively stops all of those questions about did this really happen, to whom and when and where. But when I speak of a biomythography, I speak of a work of fiction which has been composed in the way that I think really effective fiction should, which is out of myself.
We're getting high signs that there are calls.
Oh.
But we don't want to take them yet. Finish your sentence.
That fiction should be constructed out of our lives, not out of the air. That when we speak of imagination, we speak not of constructing something which is unreal, but how do we use what in fact has been real to highlight what we wish to say. That, to me, is fiction. So when I speak of biomythography, I'm speaking of a work of fiction that pulls from my own knowledge, from my experience, from all of the myths that I stand here being a part of, from all of the backgrounds from my mother, from Caracou, from the West Indies, from Grenada, from Africa, from New York City, from Mexico, all of the things that come to reside within me, and also a piece of my vision of what can possibly become. When we put these together, that's what I tried to do, and in a sense the writing of that book was a lifeline for me. I learned a great deal. I learned in the way that I think all learning takes place, which is we teach what we most need to learn, and while we are teaching, we find it out. I mean, I could never write a paragraph. I learned how to write prose. I learned how to write fiction by teaching my students.
Well, I've read the biomythography, and I think it's wonderful. I can't wait until it comes out. I think it's going to be an absolute
I can't wait either.
Delight of a book, and I'm sure all of your many fans are going to stand online at the door. One of the things that did come out of the Writers' Congress that many of us were enthusiastic about is the notion that we really need to get a much broader bunch of resources so that women of color, lesbian women have access to publishing that we don't have. We don't have that.
That's what Kitchen Table is about.
I want you to talk about Kitchen Table Press because I think it's going to be really important.
Kitchen Table, Woman of Color Press, is a press which is in the process of being formed right now. And I'm very, very excited and very proud to be a part of the collective that is bringing it into being. We're a group of women of color who met in Boston a year and 7 months ago and decided that now was the time, that each of us in our own way, we were a collection of artists, of poets, of production people, of public relations women, and we decided that each one of us in our own way had spoken of the inability to get what we had to say out, or having heard the night before so many wonderful women share their work with us that we knew would never be shared. And we thought, this is the time. With our necks in the noose, with Reaganomics sweeping the country, with homophobia and sexism and ageism and racism totally on the rise, this was the time for us to do something that needed to be done. And we came together around that, and we said, well, by 1982, we wish to have a reality in production. And we've been working toward that. And there's been wonderful support from many, many different women's communities, from the women's communities and communities of color in general. We have, of course, we're based here in New York, but we have regional editors, Paula Gunn Allen in the West Coast, women in the South. And we spoke about this. We have been talking about it because what we wish to do, of course, is have a press that will be supported through our communities, that in addition to applying for grants or whatever, that women recognize that this is one of the survival tools, that women of color have never had a chance to control the presentation of our own voices, to share, for instance, to have the means by which to share this and also to have a real control and input into this. And this is why it is so important that this happen now, that we begin to make for instance, the connections through our different communities, that we begin to recognize the differences between us and those things that hold us together, and inform this with a feminist consciousness and work.
Great. We're going to have on December 4th Barbara Smith and
Yes.
Sherry Moraga on this program who will talk more about Kitchen Table Press. But who are the other women in the collective, and how are you breaking up your tasks? I mean, are you all doing the same thing? Are you all going to read the same manuscripts?
There's Myrna Bain, Hattie Gossett, Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, Sri Moraga, and Fei Chiang. Now, these are the women who are based in New York. We have Paula Gunn Allen, who is in
California,
on the West Coast. Yes, Rosario Morales in New England. We have women that we're making contact with, for instance, Michelle Cliff, also in Massachusetts, who will deal with manuscripts from particular areas. We want very much to have a consciousness feed into this press that is not regional. Do you see?
Mm-hmm. That's great. Do you have anybody in the South? I mean,
we will.
You will.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be wonderful. I noticed that you actually already have a flyer for Kitchen Table Press, which is which refers people to Box 592 Van Brunt, BRUNT Station, Brooklyn, New York 11215. And so for more information as it evolves regarding Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, that's Box 592 Van Brunt Station, Brooklyn, New York 11215.
And of course, you will have the other editors. You will have other editors speaking on your program also, which will be very good.
On December 4th, we're going to have that. We're going to have that show. You know, one of the things that we've been talking about, you and me, when we're alone, is this kind of planned forgetfulness. in our culture. The fact that we have to do so many things, every generation has to do it
yes,
again.
Indeed.
And I guess one of the really good things is that even though every generation seems to have to do it again right now, one has the sense that there are women, black and white women, who are making a real effort to work together on a new level of consciousness. I think that organizations like DARE, Dykes Against Racism Everywhere, are making a tremendous effort to deal with white racism in our own community.
And white racism as it is manifested on an international level also. For instance, the upcoming program of the Women of El Salvador, which is being sponsored by Dykes Against Racism Everywhere, I think is a very important program.
Where is that? When is that going Well, we will announce that on the air as soon as we find out when it is going to be, so we don't have to panic that we don't know exactly when it is going to be now. But what I want to ask you, Audre, in terms of your own views, I remember you wrote a poem after the first march, the first women's demonstration in August 26th, about how there were all of these
yes,
things that
who said it was simple?
Who said it was simple? And the last line of that is, which of these? How does it go? Which of these?
But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see cause and color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations.
That's it. Which me will survive all these liberations?
Yeah.
The question that I want to raise with you is, where do you think we're going now? I mean, where do you think white women can work effectively with black women, and where can they work alone? And what do you see as you travel around the country in terms of positive change? Because I just came back from Ithaca today, and I was really delighted in Ithaca to see so many young people, black and white, really thinking about racism and sexism and homophobia. Here we are in the middle of Reagan's onslaught, and really about 200 or 300 students were at my talk in force, just so positive, a lot of high energy, nothing of this depression that one would suspect they would love us to feel at this moment. And quite the opposite is going on. There's a tremendous amount of organizing. The women are returning to the Pentagon on November 15th and 16th. I've gone to several meetings of the women returning to the Pentagon movement, and there's just so much activity in terms of peace, in terms of civil rights, in terms of black and white women working together again.
I'd like to see that carried on, and I'd like to see some of those students hopefully go into their communities and spread the kind of word. I think it's very necessary that black and white women deal with the creative uses of differences between us and how they can move us toward the things that we share, towards the goals that we share. I think it's imperative also that, for instance, that women of color continue this work within our communities, as well as, for instance, you, as a white woman, deal with your community. I'm saying this because I'm thinking about the kind of blindness that I see with some younger women or younger students, 18, 19 years old, and I keep thinking, what about their older sisters and brothers who had the word 10 years ago, 12 years ago? Did they spread it? And if they did, why is it then that I, who was speaking 16 years ago, am still having to say these same things to another generation? So I think it's really very important that we maintain this sense of being part of a continuity, that what we get, we pass on. And I think as white women do this, there will be a larger and larger group of women, younger women, able to deal with their differences, able to come together, whatever our communities may be.
Well, I mean, one of the things that, of course, is so hard is that the entire media militates against
this. Yes.
I mean, it's really kind of shocking to turn on the television these days. Somebody told me there was a panel recently about what feminism and the civil rights movement has done to television. Well, if you turn on television, you have this terrible, dreary sense that, well, not very much. And there is such an effort in the establishment media to deny what is actually going on around the country. And that's my sense. I mean, as I go around the country, I am impressed with a lot of political activity. But if you turn on the television, you don't get any of that.
And I think that this is probably, this may sound very cynical, but I think it's probably just as well, Blanche. I've been impressed also in my traveling in the last year with how much is going on sub rosa. The little group in Dismal Seepage, Idaho.
Is there really a Dismal Seepage, Idaho?
No, there probably isn't, but it's an amalgam of a number of small towns that you and I would never have heard of if we did not happen to have come through there to speak or to meet with a group.
Right.
Well, there's really exciting things being done. For instance, groups of women who are dealing with the local prison, who are attempting to, for instance, make contacts with women in other places, even abroad. This kind of surge, this kind of question, but we hear nothing about this.
Mm-hmm.
We hear nothing about this, and maybe it's just as well. For instance, the women who are publishing each other's work in Austin, Texas. Now, those books will not get here, unfortunately, but they will get throughout Texas. And there are other women who are reading this and are beginning to think the possibility that their voices can have an effect if they can say what they truly feel. This kind of movement that comes from the very bottom, I think, is what we have to rely on ultimately, because as soon, in the same way as Niera said that governments by definition are reactionary, media, at the point at which it becomes as large, as a giant as media is in this country, must also by definition be reactionary.
Yeah. See,
with the exception of WBAI and listener-sponsored radio.
Listener-sponsored radio. I actually disagree with you that it's a good thing. I agree with you that that's what we have to rely on, and we have to really recognize that we are a hungry, cultured people. I think we must know that. But the only privileged people who get to know it are people who can travel and do travel. So many people rely on the media as their only means of communication. And so actually I think it's a crime and not a good thing that little, let me just finish my thought, that so little information gets to the people, because we need that information. And I just want to make a pitch for the freedom of information. That the kind of, I noticed in the Times just last week, or maybe it was even this week, that the State Department is instituting a truth squad to counter Soviet disinformation. Now that truth squad is being erected, excuse the expression, by the State Department at a time when they are making incredible charges that the Soviet Union is responsible for the peace movement, the big peace activities in England and in Rome and in Germany and in France this past month. Now, they're making those charges at the same time they're telling us we can't have the documents when we are going to be exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. You can't have this knowledge, but you must believe our Truth Squad charges. Do you see? And I feel then that we are very manipulated, and if it's not for the fact that we are a hungry, cultured people, and if it's not for listener-sponsored radio, not only WBAI, but all over the country, and by the way, there's a great movement to have more and more listener-sponsored radio, and I think that's just wonderful, and if it's not for, kitchen table press and the tremendous revolution, really, in the small press, we would actually be starved. And
this is the point that I'm trying to make. You've just said that. I'm not denying what you were saying earlier concerning the real need to get the word out. But I think that we need to be very, very realistic. And I know that you are, Blanche. I'm not saying that you're not. But I think we need to be very realistic about the enormity of the forces, the reality, the enormity of the forces aligned against us. And to say that we need to construct the existing media, with the exception of genuine grassroots supported media such as Pacifica and WBAI, to say that we need to turn the structures of media as they are around to serve our purposes, I think is to be idealistic to the point of destruction. That we need to recognize, for instance, that it is only in places like Kitchen Table Women of Color Press and the small press movement and almost the word-to-word, mouth-to-mouth word that we are going to be able to develop and keep and spread genuine movements for change, genuine examinations of what's going on. Because we will never be able to rally on our side those forces for whom our side represents destruction.
Well, I think that's really true. This is Blanche Cook, Women and the World in the 1980s. I'm talking with Audre Lorde. Audre, you have just written a poem. You're not getting away easy on this program, about Africa. And I would like you to read that
No,
poem.
it's not about Africa.
It's
it is
not
about the ways in which women of color connect internationally. It is specifically a poem that was dedicated to Winnie Mandela. You know who Winnie Mandela is?
Tell us who she is.
Winnie Mandela is a South African freedom fighter. She is the mother of Zinzi Mandela, the young South African poet. She's also, her husband, Nelson Mandela, has been imprisoned on Robben Island for the last 20 years for their joint work, and Winnie has been exiled to various inclement parts to keep her from speaking. She has an indomitable strength, so far as I can tell, and here it is very hard. I felt a great affinity to her. It must have been at least 10 years ago, the first time I saw her mentioned. It is very hard to find any kind of information about her. Hard for me, so that whenever I meet black women, South African women, I ask, what is happening. But other than that, there's almost no contact that we have, of course, in this country. And it was, this poem came out of the way I experienced that particular sense in 1977, when they were shooting the children down in Soweto, when there was a tiny, tiny piece on the back page of the New York Times concerning Winnie Mandela having been moved again into exile and silenced, meaning she's not allowed to meet with anyone. She does not speak the language of the place where she is living now with her youngest child. And that, of course, never appeared on any of the media, never appeared on any of the 6 o'clock news programs. And I was watching a news program that night and thought about the absence of that. And that's how this poem occurred. And the title of it is The Evening News. First rule of the road, attend quiet victims first. I am needing my bread, Winnie Mandela, that while children who sing in the streets of Soweto are jailed for inciting to riot, the moon in Soweto is mad, is bleeding my sister into the earth, is mixing her seed with the vultures. Greeks reap her like olives out of the trees. She is skimmed like salt from the skin of a hungry desert. While the Gambier fisherwomen with milk-large breasts hide a fish with the face of a small girl in the prow of their boats. Winnie Mandela, I am feeling your face with the pain of my crippled fingers. Our children are escaping their births in the streets of Soweto and Brooklyn. What does it mean, our wars being fought by our children? Winnie Mandela, our names are like olive, salt, sand, the opal, amber, obsidian that hide their shapes well. We have never touched shaven foreheads together. Yet how many of our sisters' and daughters' bones whiten in secret, whose names we have not yet spoken, whose names we have never spoken? I have never heard their names spoken. Second rule of the road, any wound will stop bleeding if you press down hard enough.
Thank you very much. This is going to be in your new book of poems.
Yes, chosen poems, old and new.
And this is, Norton is publishing this book?
It will be published by Norton in the spring of 1982.
Oh, that's great. Give us a final word.
I'm very glad to be here.
Oh, I'm very glad that you were here,
In
too.
all senses of the word, I'm glad to be here, and I intend to continue being here and doing my work.
Okay. And your work gives you power, and Audre Lorde, it gives us power, and I'm very glad that you're here.
Thank
too.
you, Blanche.
This is Blanche Cook, Women of the World in the 1980s. Thank you very much.